Hi, this is Elisabeth Hancock, host of the Great Awakening podcast. So, this week I wanted to talk about these old Tartarian images and linking that to possible ETs coming to Earth, taking indigenous tribes away and bringing them back again, maybe even as far as 1,000 years later. So, the reason I got thinking about this is because I've now seen literally hundreds of these old world photos said to have been taken in the 1800s, and they look very, very old. But what's so interesting about them is that they appear to have been photoshopped in some way. They appear to have had the backgrounds taken out because the backgrounds are always just pure white. And although we're told that this is what the early photos look like, I sort of think, well, that's very convenient, isn't it? Because we can't see anything behind these buildings at all, which begs the question, what's there? The second thing is that these buildings are literally in streets which are all paved with mud. And that got me thinking, would they really build these wonderful, intricate old world buildings and then just leave the streets paved with mud? And I'm not too sure that they would. And then the third thing is that they're literally empty. There's no one around, there's nobody there at all. And you just see these giant buildings like the ones in St. Petersburg, these really amazing old world buildings. And you can see that this was a deserted town, a deserted time. And of course, this is now when we have these theories about the mud floods and a mud flood which rolled over the whole of the Northern Hemisphere and crushing the smaller buildings and leaving these larger buildings behind. And it also got me thinking, well, would these larger buildings still be there? You can see there are some buildings around, like I saw a group of buildings in Scotland which were completely buried, and you could just see like the roof and half a window, showing that this had been buried during this mud flood period. But these larger buildings really hadn't. They were surrounded by mud, but they still looked quite intact. And that got me thinking, were these preserved in some way? Was ancient technology used in some way to preserve or put sort of like an energetic field around them so that they weren't destroyed in the way that all the other buildings were? As with everything at the moment, there's so much misinformation. We can see that there are also a lot of these photos, images in circulation that have been photoshopped, and many of them you can see that people have been added to them, and they look quite out of context, either looking a little bit darker, too dark, or maybe a little bit too large, but you can see that they've been added. You can also see that these old world buildings, many of which have been referred to as the fairs, the world fairs, which spanned over 100-year period in every city around the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see that these buildings, they are just absolutely massive. You can see the people walking around, which there's only a few of them, but walking around these fairs. And these buildings are probably 25 times higher than they are. And these buildings are said to have been made out of papier-mâché. And we've seen again images where these papier-mâché sort of columns are being prepared. And again, it's just absolutely unbelievable. Would these people really have spent their time, having just arrived in the Americas only a couple of 100 years earlier, would they really have spent their time making great big, huge papier-mâché buildings 25 stories high? How would they even get them up to 25 stories high? I mean, it's just not logical. It's just not logical at all. And just really sparks so many questions. But after looking at hundreds of these photos, which I now have, I began to think about the indigenous tribes and their stories, one of which is when they talk of being taken off planet during cataclysmic events and then brought back again once the earth had calmed down. What they're saying is that although for them it felt like it was just a couple of months, it may have even been up to 1,000 years for some of them. And when they came back, they were coming back to a planet that had been destroyed. So is this maybe what we are seeing with the mud floods? That they are coming back to repopulate a different continent where you have these massive, great big, massive old world buildings still, which were obviously used to power their cities. You can see that there's an energy technology there to harness the energy from the ether, to harness the energy from the sound of the bells. maybe the organs, but you can see that they have this sort of technology that then just spread across the entire northern hemisphere. And then it got me thinking, okay, so if these people had then come back after being absent or away for a couple of months, up to 1,000 years, were they coming back to this same time period? Now, of course, the time periods never add up, and you really have to think outside of the box. I've actually now given up trying to find times that fit together because they just never ever do. We can see that we've probably had 1,000 years added to our time frame. And Russia talks about how 5,500 years has been taken off their time frame. Interestingly, the Russians now are starting to put back their old history back into their education curriculum because their history has been altered. And this was altered in the early 1800s, indicating that they lost a war, that maybe something come in, say something came in, something took over, something invaded. They, if you like, dropped down their weapons, and then they took on the cultures, the religions of the invading people. And in the process, they deleted their own history. Now they're bringing back their history, which again, it begs the question, okay, so what's changed now? Has someone else lost a war? Have they now negotiated a period? What's happening now? And this always makes me think of Guy Addison's Satan's Little Season, where Satan was allowed to have 250 years of causing absolute chaos. And then if you like, the good guys would come back in again in 250 years, which would be up in 2026, and we're able to now bring all the good stuff back in again. So another piece of information that I came across is that the Moors were the inhabitants of the Americas, and they were a key part of the Tartarian Empire and made up a large part of the Americas, North America, of Africa. Morocco was their center, and we have the Tartarians, the Russian Mongolia is their center. But the Moors were a big part of this Tartarian Empire, and they were said to have taken up North America, which, of course, we know that the Moors are dark skinned and they are black, which then shows us that it was actually Black people who were the inhabitants of the Americas. So we have been taught in history today that it is the slave trade took all these Black people from Africa over to the Americas in the 1700s, and that's how they all got there. But maybe this is something else which has been completely made up, completely fabricated, and it's leading us to believe, or leading Black people to believe, that they were slaves, that they were not a prominent part of our world. And of course, what does that then do to children in the schools learning about this type of history? If this Tartarian Empire and the Moors taking up the North America is true, it shows that actually these Black people not only had prominent positions of power, but they were very wealthy. They lived alongside white people in a completely normal way, something which I've always felt to be the case. I think this whole black and white fighting thing is just another thing that's been created by whoever these people are in order to get us fighting. Everything has been created to get us fighting. And if you look around at us, we are really fighting against each other, aren't we? There's always something new. Now we have the transgender thing, and we're all fighting about that as well. But I think what we need to stop doing is stop fighting, ask ourselves who benefits from this, who benefits from us being told that Black people were slaves and white people were white supremacists. Who benefits from all of this? Well, it's not us. It's the people who are in power, or the deep state, whatever we want to call them. But really, this history, the Moors being a prominent part of North America, it's actually showing us that we were living together in harmony. When I think about Tartaria, I'm always reminded of the Ghibli anime, Howl's Moving Castle, where there are different realms and they're fighting with each other. Howl himself can shapeshift into a bird, and there are many other mages around where one of the empires is trying to kill off the mages because they don't like all the power that they have. What is so interesting about it is that there are multi-dimensional realms, with Howl's castle opening different doors and going to different realms, which I'm beginning to think is what our past was like too. Quantum physics is appearing to show that everything is happening now. And this would certainly make sense when you think of our world. Time frames never fit. We have islands that disappear and come back again. We have the what's behind the ice wall. We have elements of our world where it feels like there's simulations on top of simulations. And so it does feel that there is a multidimensional aspect to it. And we can also see in our own brains, our brains can link to 11 dimensions. It can create structures up to 11 dimensions in shape and size, showing that our brains can already mold itself and change itself to be able to see and connect with other dimensions. So our eyes are not able to see the other dimensions around us, but our brain seems to have the capacity to be able to connect with the other dimensions around us, again indicating that we are a multidimensional species, but we have been locked down into one dimension in some way. Not for our benefit, of course, but for the benefit of the people who are currently in power. The same people who possibly are the ones who invaded Russia and got them to change their history. The same people who seem to have been going around the planet and taking over things. The same people who own 99% of the media, the newspapers, the films. It's these, I think, quite small group of people who just seem to have taken on these pivotal points of power. And because of that, they've sort of infiltrated from within. And I think that they seem to just be very strategic in the way that they're doing things. And it reminds me of that Machiavellian approach to war, leading us to think that maybe there is a war, but it's a very underground, subtle war that we're just not really able to properly see, but we can sort of sense it. So if we come back to the 1,000 years, so 1,000 years has gone and the indigenous tribes are coming back. 1,000 years has been added to our timeline. It seems to keep coming back. Could this explain why time doesn't fit into our past history? And maybe even why this old world architecture seemed to be left standing by itself? When it was reclaimed by men, it already looked old. The indigenous people say that when the world was destroyed through cataclysms, they were taken to safety by advanced beings. And this was either under the ocean, up into the sky, or inside the earth, like the Hopi. As they are darker skinned people, could these then have gone on to be the original inhabitants of America, explaining the darker skin of the Moors? We do know from the indigenous tribes that after each cataclysmic event, which wiped out pretty much most of humanity, these indigenous tribes were brought back, and then they were the ones that reseeded the planet afterwards. And this would explain maybe why these original inhabitants of these countries were darker skinned. Timeframes don't fit. Again, timeframes don't fit in, but we do know that the Great Flood is recorded as being 9,600 BCE. And this old world architecture can't be that old, but neither could the Tartarian Empire, unless time has been massively reduced in our history. And it makes it very difficult to track these things. But it is certainly interesting when we dig deeper into the indigenous people's oral stories of their history, because they can trace their ancestral lines back to 85,000 years ago. And they all say that they once lived in Atlantis or Lemuria, again showing us that these civilizations were also real, even though the history books also deny their existence as well. So many great empires have been denied by historians. But why? I think it's because they don't want us to know how great we once were and still are. They prefer us to believe that we've evolved from apes, because then it makes us believe that we're just animals and not divine sparks of source, or not multidimensional beings ourselves, with incredible brains and bodies that can do incredible things. To back up the indigenous people's belief that they were taken off planet during the Great Flood, or one of the floods, as there have been a few of them, there are also 270 references worldwide to arks rescuing people during great times of cataclysm. However, sometimes these arks are described as being metal, not wood, as I've talked about in a previous episode. Another interesting piece of research comes from Tibet, where ancient texts talk of waves reaching the tops of the Himalayas and being 3 miles high. The next question I ask myself is, where was the person standing who saw this? To see this high up, they would have had to have been above it. Otherwise, they would have drowned themselves, which seems to indicate that they were in some sort of a craft above the waves, above the Himalayas. We know that we don't have all the information of our past or our origins and who we shared the planet with during Atlantis and Lemuria. So all we can do is try and fit a few pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together and get this information out into the collective consciousness so that we can all become another piece of the puzzle. Either way, I can see that the only thing that is important during this time of great awakening is to stay in the heart. Trust your inner knowing and don't let the chaotic world bring you into fear. Most of what we see isn't real. It's just the regressives or parasites trying to keep the vibration low so they can carry on existing in this world a bit longer. The higher we raise our vibration, the more they literally disappear from our reality and lives because they cannot exist at this higher vibration. The world is moving to this higher vibration. They know this and they cannot exist in this, which means that they are going. They are trying to keep us trapped in lower vibrations of fear, chaos, worry, guilt, shame, whatever it may be, depravity, looking at Netflix. They're trying to keep us in this really low vibration so that we don't move out of their clutches. We've been their energy source, their food source for such a long time. They are not ready to lose that. And they are not ready to ascend themselves. They like staying in the depravity. And it means that they just continue to stay with lower vibrational races, planets, which they then feed off. We as a species, as a collective, as a planet are moving. So they're doing everything in their power to keep the vibration low. But there's nothing that they can do about it. This is happening now, whether they like it or not. I'm convinced that we have all the pieces of the puzzle around us, but we have to find the pieces and fit them in the right places. And I think you, me, all of us, we're all getting together with our jigsaw pieces, we're all fitting them together, and we are all learning more about our history and who we are as a species, while the planet and the collective continues to ascend. So that's all for this week, and I'll catch up with you next week. All right, take care. Bye.